Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi-part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 506, The Peaceful City. The last few episodes have been, politically speaking, a tale of one step forward and two steps back for Japan's ruling emperors. On the one hand, in the century and a half since the 645 coup d'etat against the Soga clan and the start of the Taika reforms, the rulers of the country had done a pretty good job constructing a far more centralized state than had previously existed, and at beginning the process of creating a Chinese-style government bureaucracy, complete with a Chinese-style capital city, to go along with it. On the other hand, the constant divisions within the imperial family, and battles between the emperors and their most powerful subordinate clans, had not exactly stopped. Indeed, in a certain sense, now that the government was stronger than ever, there was kind of more to fight for. Indeed, by the final years of what became known as the Nara period, based on the name of the city used as the capital at that time, the emperor had been largely subjugated by the powerful Fujiwara family, which had placed a puppet ruler from a more complacent line of the imperial family on the throne. However, the emperors were not done vying for power, and here we come to one of those historical figures who just so happened to be at the right place at the right time, Emperor Kanmu. Emperor Kanmu was born Prince Yamabe, in a fairly obscure line of the imperial family. On his father's side, he was of imperial stock. However, his mother was from another high-ranking clan, descended primarily from Korean aristocrats from the old kingdom of Baekje, who had migrated to Japan after that kingdom fell to its neighbor and rival Shilla. Since he was not of full imperial stock, because as you may have noticed there was a good amount of inbreeding within the imperial clan, Kanmu's branch of the family was considered relatively unprestigious. However, his branch did have something going for it. His father was descended from Emperor Tenji, and therefore of a different line of the imperial clan from the one which had dominated politics for the last 100 years, which was descended from Tenji's brother Temmu and his wife Jito. That branch of the imperial line had vied with powerful clans in government, especially the Fujiwara, for control of the state, and so after the death of Empress Shotoku/Empress Koken in 770, when the Fujiwara clan leadership decided they didn't want someone from the Tenmu branch on the throne, well, you can guess where this is going. And so Emperor Kanmu's father, known to history as Emperor Konin, was plucked from relative obscurity to take the throne on behalf of his Fujiwara clan puppet masters. Kanmu himself was not initially named crown prince and instead worked in one of the imperially sponsored academies set up to train bureaucrats on the Chinese model. However, his father's preferred heir died suddenly in the mid-770s, and so Kanmu became the new crown prince, and in 781, he became Japan's new emperor. Early in his reign, Kanmu remained very much under the thumb of the branch of the Fujiwara clan that had come to power after Empress Shotoku's death, the line led by Fujiwara no Momokawa, which had put his father on the throne. Specifically, Kanmu's main advisor was Fujiwara no Tanetsugu, Momokawa's nephew, who was just a year younger than Kanmu and who had arrived at court around the same time, and helped pick Kanmu's father Konin for the throne in the first place. Kanmu clearly put great stock in Tanetsugu. After his ascension to the throne, he granted Tanetsugu a series of rank increases and postings, which saw him attain the position of Chunagon, or middle counselor, by 784. Tanetsugu was also instrumental to one of Kanmu's earliest and most important schemes, a plan to once again, wait for it, relocate the imperial capital. There are a few reasons why Kanmu might have wanted to do this. As was the case in previous instances of relocation, he did not explain his reasoning to us. Perhaps he felt the upheaval of the last few decades made Nara a spiritually undesirable location. I have to admit, though, there's another theory I find a bit more compelling. In the past, powerful emperors had gained a degree of political independence by relocating the capital, moving it away from existing vested interests, and also piling a bunch of expenses onto their courtiers, building new palaces for themselves in the new capital, to weaken the opposing great clans financially, also weakening existing financial interests in the capital which may have tried to influence the court. So, for example, it had been the powerful Empress Jito who moved the capital to Fujiwara-kyo almost 100 years earlier, and gained a degree of independence from previously powerful interest groups as a result. It's quite possible Kanmu noticed this pattern and saw relocating the capital as a way to weaken the powerful interests around him, both the clans and the wealthy Buddhist temples of Nara, which had grown used to being able to push the throne for more money and more support. By weakening them, he could strengthen his own hand. Kanmu's proposed site also fit the bill if this was his reasoning. He suggested first a move to what became Nagaoka-kyo, a site northeast of what became modern Osaka, near where the Katsura, Kizu, and Uji rivers come together to form the Yodo River and flow into the inland sea. This also just so happened to be an area where his mother's clan had a great deal of economic and political influence because most of their landholdings were there. It was also the home base for Fujiwara no Tanetsugu's mother's family. So possibly Kanmu's goal here was to move the imperial court to a place where he felt he would have more potential allies and away from institutions or clans he saw as trying to control him. However, the Nagaoka-kyo project did not really work out, though Kanmu was in such a haste to get out of Nara that he moved the capital officially after only 1 year of work and before most of the buildings were complete. Unfortunately, Nagaoka-kyo turned out to be on a floodplain thanks to those nearby rivers, and was very cramped in terms of space by mountains to the west and north. The site was abandoned within a decade, though in the interim it may have served a purpose for Kanmu. You see, in 785, while overseeing the construction of Nagaoka-kyo personally, Fujiwara no Tanetsugu was shot by an arrow. He died of his injuries the next day. Emperor Kanmu was, given the incomplete nature of his palace, away touring his realm when this happened, but rushed back to the court to launch an investigation. That investigation ended up implicating several members of the most powerful clans at court in a plot to assassinate the emperor's foremost advisor, particularly what were then the two most powerful rivals to the Fujiwara, the Otomo and Saeki families. Said investigation also ended up implicating Emperor Kanmu's own heir, his younger half-brother whom he'd been pressured into appointing crown prince back when his own son was too young to take the throne. Said half-brother ended up being exiled and responded to the humiliation by starving himself to death. Now, Fujiwara no Tanetsugu's assassination appeared to be a random act of political violence inspired by court intrigue, and possibly by clans like the Otomo and Saeki feeling threatened by the move of the capital, which would certainly weaken them financially and involve moving into territory where their opponents were stronger. However, the whole thing also worked out quite well for Kanmu. He was rid in one stroke of some of the most powerful opponents to further consolidation of his rule, and left with a Fujiwara clan who were ostensibly his allies but still dangerous, and also now leaderless, and he got to put his own son into the crown prince role. This is all so convenient that more than a few have suspected Kanmu of masterminding the whole affair. There's absolutely no proof of this, and to be honest, it doesn't really fit the image of Kanmu we have from the rest of his reign. He was educated in the Chinese Confucian tradition of rule through moral example and hard work, which doesn't really square with political assassination, but still one has to wonder, and it's true that more than a few educated Confucians in China were not above ensuring that their opponents had happy little accidents. What is clear is that Kanmu, good administrator that he was, could tell the Nagaoka-kyo project was not working out well, not to mention a whole slew of natural disasters over the next year after Tanetsugu's assassination, which were blamed on the vengeful spirit of the exiled former crown prince. And so, the combination of spiritual and practical concern led to looking for yet another site, this time slightly to the northeast. That site was given the name Heian-kyo, or the capital of peaceful tranquility, though today we know it better as Kyoto. This new capital was far better situated to deal with the concerns that had scuttled Nagaoka-kyo. It was not as prone to flooding, had far more space to expand, and was still easy enough to connect to the inland sea via the Kamo River, which flows into the Katsura. When he chose the site, Kanmu probably did not think he was establishing a permanent imperial capital. After all, maybe down the line the exact same factors that had led to him moving the capital there would lead to another change. But of course, that's not how it worked out. The capital Kanmu established would, for reasons we're going to talk about over the course of the next few episodes, remain the home of Japan's emperors for over 1,000 years after this point. And this is probably the act Kanmu is best known for, but it's not the only one. By the time Kanmu moved the court to Kyoto in 794, he was in his 50s, a classically trained scholar and administrator who exercised more power than probably any emperor before him, given that he had less to worry about in terms of influence or interference from the noble clans. Like Temmu and Jito, more than a century earlier, he took advantage of the opening to stack the imperial administration, not with powerful aristocrats from the great clans, but with relatives from the imperial family whose loyalties could be trusted. Where such men were not available, he simply left the offices vacant and relied on his own administrative know-how to handle things. For example, barring the very first year of his reign, the position of Minister of the Left, one of the highest roles in the government, was vacant. After its office holder died in 796, Kanmu similarly did not fill the role of Minister of the Right for more than 2 years, before eventually handing the job off to a trusted cousin. By the final decade of his reign, not a single member of the once dominant or powerful Fujiwara clan held an office above the post of Chunagon or Middle Counselor. And it wasn't like his administration suffered for doing this. Kanmu relied on his Confucian training to implement a series of reforms to agriculture, religious administration, and other areas, about which we will have more to say in the future. But the thing he's best known for is creating one of the most important jobs in Japanese history to deal with a pressing issue. Very little is known to us today of the non-Wajin, which is to say the non-ethnically Japanese peoples of northern Honshu. It's commonly theorized they were descendants of the old Jomon culture we talked about in episode 501, who remained independent of continental influence which created the subsequent Yayoi and Kofun cultures. Again, we don't know much about these people, whose lands in the late 700s started around what's now Fukushima and Niigata prefectures, and continued up to the northern tip of Honshu. Even their name is a matter of some controversy. The characters used to describe them in Japanese are commonly read emishi, but other readings are sometimes suggested, ebisu being one of the most common. We know that upon meeting 2 members of this group in a Japanese diplomatic mission in the 600s, the Tang Dynasty Emperor Gaozong described them as odd-looking. But odd in what way? We don't know. We know that both male and female emishi, which by the way is the reading I'm going to use because it's the most common, wore their hair in a style resembling, quote, a small mallet, I assume that's some kind of bun, and that men could have extremely long beards. Some records say as long as 4 feet. Some earlier records refer to them as mojin, the hairy people, and it's thought that emishi, literally shrimp barbarians, is a reference to the long whiskers of the men, similar to the antennae of a shrimp. On the other hand, that whole hairy thing might have just been a reference to them wearing furs instead of fabrics. Obviously, one of the biggest issues is that we know little about the emishi from the people themselves. Archaeology has given us some clues, like suggesting a mixed hunter-gatherer and agricultural economy, similar to the late Jomon and early Yayoi peoples, but not much beyond that. Much of what we know about the emishi comes from Japanese records, and they are, to put it lightly, not terribly favorable. For example, here is how the emishi are described in the Nihon Shoki by the legendary emperor Keiko. Quote, it is known that the Eastern Outlanders are by nature fierce and wild, and that their chief interest is violent assault. Their villages lack chiefs, and their settlements lack heads. Coveting territory, they all rob each other. The fiercest of these Eastern Outlanders are the Emishi. Men and women live mixed together, nor is there any distinction between father and son. In winter they lodge in holes, in the summer they dwell in nests. They wear furs and drink blood. Eldest and younger brothers are distrustful of each other. Climbing mountains, they are like flying birds. Running through grass, they are like furry beasts in flight. They forget benefits received, but always requite wrongs suffered, and for that purpose conceal an arrow in their top knots and wear a sword under their robes. Sometimes they band together and invade the border regions. Sometimes they spy out opportune times in agriculture and sericulture and rob the people. If attacked, they hide in the grass. If pursued, they go into the mountains. Consequently, they have never since ancient times been subject to the transforming royal influence. And by the way, this whole speech is given by Emperor Keiko while he is charging one of his ministers with subjugating these barbarians. That minister will not prove successful. Despite this rather derogatory view, relations between the Wajin, the ethnic Japanese, and the Emishi were not entirely bad. On the frontier, some Emishi communities traded with the local Japanese and adopted some of their technology in the process, and some Emishi served as allies of Japan's emperors, or even as administrators in the border regions. However, tensions got steadily worse over the last century after the Taika reforms, when the strengthening power of the Japanese state, intended at first to defend against a continental invasion which never materialized, was turned on the Emishi instead to claim new lands from them. Things came to a head in 780 during a campaign against an Emishi stronghold in what's now Iwate Prefecture, when an Emishi ally of the Japanese named Korehari no Azamaro rebelled and defected to the Emishi side. The resulting battle was a devastating loss for Japan's armies, and subsequent Japanese counterattacks in the 780s and 790s resulted in either devastating defeats or inconclusive battles. This conflict is sometimes called the 38 Years' War, and as the name implies, victory, which did eventually come, was a grueling endeavor for the Japanese side, won by a slow program of claiming the land valley by valley and town by town, and then setting up fortified outposts to defend the seized territory and serve as a base for expansion forward. Given the slow burn nature of the strategy, it would take until the late 800s for the Emishi lands in Honshu to be nominally subjugated, and rebellions and uprising plagued the region for the next several centuries. Kanmu was one of the chief architects of this first war effort, though of course given how long subjugating the Emishi would take, completing the conflict would fall to his successors. In that context, he is important for two reasons. First, the very same year that Kanmu moved the court officially to Kyoto, he designated one of his officials to serve as the overall commander of the war effort, Otomo no Yakamochi, a distinguished poet and statesman. Otomo was given a brand new title in his role as war coordinator, Sei Taishogun, or Supreme General for the Subduing of Barbarians. Of course, that's a bit of a mouthful, which is why we often use the shorter version, Shogun. These early shoguns did not resemble at all the later incarnation of the office. Among other things, early on it rotated every few years, instead of the shogun being functionally in his role for life. Eventually, of course, claimants to the role of shogun would functionally supplant the role of the imperial government in actually running the country, but we are still many centuries away from that point. Speaking of which, Kanmu would also be the one to begin a long and slow but important change in how Japan's military forces were organized. Before this point, the armies of Japan's imperial throne were organized on, wait for it, a model based on Imperial China. Astonishing, I know, none of you saw that coming. What that meant, in practice, was a system of conscript levies, where the state used its census data on individual villages to requisition young men of fighting age, who were called up for service as foot soldiers and then returned to civilian life after the conflict. The system is comparatively cheap. Soldiers are, after all, a drain on the economy and don't produce anything of economic value, the heads of your enemies being, I suppose, priceless in multiple senses. It also allows for organized states to call up very large armies. But conscription is very slow. You have to issue call-up notices, gather your draftees, train and equip them, and given that they're draftees, you're not going to have time to teach them how to ride horses, which is both very expensive and time-consuming, so they are walking everywhere, which is not exactly fast. And this simply didn't work well against the raid-based tactics of the Emishi, who knew the lands of northern Honshu way better than the Japanese did, and who relied heavily on hit-and-run attacks out of the mountains and forests of the north. To address this deficit, starting under Kanmu, the throne started to organize a new type of military force. The notion of how to organize these fighters came from several different places, most notably and completely astonishingly, Imperial China, where the Tang dynasty maintained a professional mercenary army of Fubing, or territorial soldiers, on its northern borders, facing the horseback raiders of Inner Asia. These soldiers received financial incentives, tax benefits and the right to land, for example, in exchange for maintaining themselves at permanent fighting readiness. For example, part of the income provided by these government programs was to be used to purchase weapons and armor, as well as to pick up a hobby only the rich have time for, horsemanship. These soldiers could then be called into action at a moment's notice, and since they were on horseback, they could get to the action much faster. Kanmu's newfangled soldiers were stationed primarily in eastern Japan where the fighting was the thickest, particularly in the wide and open area known as the Kanto Plains. By the way, I've been using the name Kansai for the heartland of the imperial state for a while now. That literally means west of the pass in question being the coastal road that connects the area to the Kanto, east of the pass. And given how I am describing these professional warriors, you might start to recognize them, because, of course, they would become the basis of the samurai class, though that word is a bit of an anachronism and would not be used to describe the professional warrior class for several more centuries. Still, I am going to use it because this is intended as an intro series for people who do not necessarily know the Japanese language, and I don't want to throw any more complicated terminology at you than I absolutely have to. But this is my disclaimer, I'm simplifying a bit here. We have a pretty clear idea, of course, of the significance of this change given that warrior rule is coming a few centuries down the line. Far less clear is the fate of the Emishi themselves. Like pretty much every society in human history, ancient Japan did include the practice of slavery, and war captives were a main source of slaves. It's fairly clear large numbers of Emishi were taken into the Kansai and other areas of Japan proper, so to speak, as slaves of the state, or for powerful households, or for temples. The goal, of course, was to exploit the labor of Emishi captives, but also to forcibly break up the Emishi population by transferring its members to different areas, essentially diluting Emishi power by spreading their population around, a strategy many empires throughout history have used to control subject populations. Those who were not forced into servitude still had to deal with Japanese settlers and administrators coming into their lands. From what we can tell, they were slowly forcibly assimilated over the course of centuries, though well into the Middle Ages there were a few prominent local families that at least claimed to be of Emishi descent in the north. All told, I think it's fair to say that by the time of Emperor Kanmu's death in 807, he had cemented a legacy for himself as one of Japan's most influential reigning monarchs, beginning the conquest of the north in earnest, relocating the capital, weakening the great clans, and strengthening the throne's power in the offing. But almost immediately after his death, the balance began to tilt once again. 3 of Kanmu's sons would sit on the throne. Emperors Heizei, Saga, and Junna would reign collectively from 806 to 833, and during their rule the Fujiwara clan would slowly begin to claw back some of its former influence and prestige. The road to Fujiwara restoration was not an easy one, largely because by this point the Fujiwara family faced one of the same problems that had begun to plague the imperial family. The Fujiwara had now been, for centuries, a wealthy and prestigious one, and living in a society where one of the expectations of wealthy and prestigious men was that they have a lot of concubines to demonstrate their power, well, that means a lot of children running around, and a sprawling family tree capable of growing rapidly to a level confusing the hell out of the most veteran of history podcasters. By the early 800s, the Fujiwara family had begun to fragment along these competing, sprawling lineages, into 4 distinct branches. We respectively call these branches the Northern, Southern, Capital, and Ritual Fujiwara clans, Hokke, Nanke, Kyoke, and Shikike in Japanese. These branches were of course all related, but anyone who's been to a tense family reunion knows that blood relations can be, well, complicated, let's put it. Up until this point, the southern branch had been the dominant one, and much of the reigns of Heisei and Saga went by with the other Fujiwara branches trying, fairly successfully mind you, to tear the southern branch down. For example, Emperor Kanmu's main wife had actually been a Fujiwara, but she was a Shikike or Ritual House Fujiwara who shared her husband's hatred for the southern Fujiwara. Meanwhile, the imperial family enjoyed a period of relatively strong leadership. Emperor Heisei, it has to be said, has a mixed historical reputation, let's put it. It's possible much of that was because he was not a man terribly interested in the refined cultural arts that had come to mark a man of character among Japan's elite, about which more in the next 2 episodes, but it's also hard to escape the sense that he was not a particularly great ruler in his own right. He nearly lost his spot as crown prince because he tried to have sex with his concubine's mother, who was also a Fujiwara but not from the southern branch, and his reign was marred by several scandals, the biggest of which was a suspected coup attempt, which may or may not have just been some good old-fashioned political blood sports to remove a rival at court. However, Heisei was not on the throne very long. In 810, he was forced to abdicate due to ill health, and removed himself to the old capital at Nara. He did make a brief bid to restore himself to power, issuing orders from Nara as though he had never abdicated, and even attempting to force the court to relocate back to the old capital, but nobody followed his dictates. The whole thing was blamed primarily on Heisei's Fujiwara concubine, probably a case of an approach inherited from the Chinese Confucian historical tradition, where everything bad in government was blamed on either eunuchs or women, and said concubine was forced to commit suicide. Heisei himself lived functionally under house arrest in Nara for the rest of his life. His successor was his half-brother Emperor Saga, who used the whole debacle to boot Heisei's son from the crown prince role in favor of another half-brother, and who by contrast is very well remembered. Saga would call the shots through his own reign, and after his abdication continued to call the shots during the reign of his half-brother Junna and his own son Nimmyo, dominating the government until his death in 842. Emperor Saga did a great deal to further marginalize the Fujiwara to the widest extent possible, avoiding any marital relations with the family, or at least he did for a while, more on that in a second, and keeping members of the family out of high office where possible. By 841, the year before his death, of the 13 highest offices within the imperial bureaucracy, only 4 were held by members of the wider Fujiwara clan, and most of the rest were held by members of the imperial family or its various offshoots. Like his father, Saga was also an admirer of Chinese models of government and emphasized the promotion of men of scholarly talent into positions of power, rather than those of elite families. He also worked hard to build the imperial family an independent base of economic power, setting up estates in the provinces controlled by the imperial family to finance the court directly, in addition to its regular tax revenues. The first half-century after the founding of Kyoto is thus a period of imperial power and prestige, similar to the reigns of Temmu and Jito more than a century earlier, when the emperors were able to restore independent political power and authority. But it did not last. Indeed, the balance would tip again within literally a week of the retired Emperor Saga's death, in a moment known to history as the Jowa incident, because it took place in the 9th year of the era of Jowa, roughly meaning acquiescing to harmony. You see, over the course of the 830s, a member of one of the Fujiwara branches had managed to claw back some of the power lost by his family. His name was Fujiwara no Yoshifusa, and he was the head of the Hokke or northern branch of the Fujiwara family. Alongside his wife, Tachibana no Kachiko, a talented and charming woman from the powerful Tachibana clan, he managed to gain the favor of Emperor Saga, to the point that Saga arranged for Yoshifusa's younger sister to become a concubine of his own son, Emperor Nimmyo. The two had a son of their own, Prince Michiyasu. However, as much as Saga may have been willing to tolerate a Fujiwara marrying his son, he did not want this boy inheriting the throne, Instead, he made his son maintain one of his cousins, Prince Tsunesada, as the heir to the throne. So, fast forward to Emperor Saga's death in 842, what happens next is a bit unclear. The official histories say that the day after Emperor Saga's death, Tachibana no Kachiko was made aware of a planned coup d'etat with Prince Tsunesada at its center. His plan was to seize the throne from Emperor Nimmyo. Tsunesada, it was thought, feared that Emperor Nimmyo would disinherit him and replace Tsunesada with his own son Michiyasu, now that Emperor Saga was no longer there to prevent this from happening. Naturally, Tachibana no Kachiko informed her husband of this plot, who used his political connections to preempt the coup within a week and capture the central plotters, who conveniently turned out to be most of his political opponents in the imperial court. As you might imagine, this whole story is, as the youth say, somewhat sus, and it is commonly suspected that it was in fact Kachiko and Fujiwara no Yoshifusa themselves who set up the whole incident with the help of Emperor Nimmyo, who did want to replace the current crown prince with his own flesh and blood, now that Daddy Dearest was no longer around to stop him from doing so. The coup plotters were killed and exiled except for Prince Tsunesada, who was spared by virtue of his imperial heritage. He was instead politely encouraged to retire from politics and become a Buddhist monk. It would take a few more decades after this point, but from this time onward, the northern Fujiwara would come once again to dominate the court. How'd they do this, you might ask? Well, 8 years after this moment, Emperor Nimmyo himself would pass away, and the throne would pass to his preferred heir, Crown Prince Michiyasu, known to history as Emperor Montoku, and of course the nephew of Fujiwara no Yoshifusa. Montoku was all of 16 when he took the throne, so a teenager, in essence, and fairly easy for Yoshifusa, who was in his 40s, to control. Yoshifusa took full advantage, surrounding the emperor with Fujiwara concubines and manipulating discussions around the succession to ensure that his own preferred candidate, a child of one of those Fujiwara concubines, was then named crown prince. Then all Yoshifusa had to do was wait. Montoku was not a particularly healthy young man, and increasingly stepped away from politics before dying of an illness in 858. At that point, Yoshifusa could again install his preferred candidate, the 8-year-old crown prince, known to history as Emperor Seiwa, upon the throne. And obviously, the emperor being 8, Yoshifusa would be the one calling the shots from behind the scenes, but he took it one step further. Emperor Seiwa was not the first boy monarch in Japanese history by any shot, and as had been the case in monarchies around the world, previous youthful emperors had been supported by regents, known as sessho, who would rule on their behalf until they came of age. Previously, however, all sessho had come from the imperial house, because of course the issue with regencies is the temptation for the regent to usurp the very throne they are supposedly protecting, which is why you'd want the person holding that job to be from the same family, so they feel some sense of obligation towards the boy they are theoretically protecting. However, Fujiwara no Yoshifusa broke the rules. He arranged for the young Emperor Seiwa to name him as the regent, the very first time someone outside the imperial line took the title. And once Yoshifusa had his northern Fujiwara foot in the door, things continued predictably from there, because I am sure you will be astonished to find out this will not be the last time a member of the northern Fujiwara clan would be named regent. Fujiwara no Yoshifusa would remain the sessho, the regent for the boy emperor, for the remainder of his life. After his death in 872, his adopted son, Fujiwara no Mototsune, would continue the practice. Mototsune even advanced the practice by creating a new title, Kampaku, referring to a regent who served not a boy emperor, but an adult. After Mototsune's death, there was a 20-year period without a regency owing to some pushback by other clans, but starting in 909, the practice was restored. For the next century and a half, the twin posts of Sessho and Kampaku would be used by the northern Fujiwara to dominate the government. In Japanese, you often hear this called Sekkan Seiji, with Sekkan being a combination of Sessho and Kampaku, and Seiji referring to politics. Thus, an age of governments in Kyoto which had begun in order to restore the power of the imperial family resulted in them being more politically marginalized than ever before. Emperors during this period largely did not rule and instead were encouraged to focus on religious, ritual, or cultural pursuits, while their regents eased the imperial mind by handling this worldly distractions. It's something of an irony, though, that this period of imperial marginalization, which later nationalist historians would lambast because those behind it clearly did not sufficiently revere the authority of the imperial line, is also considered to be the cultural golden age of classical Japan. Our next 2 weeks are going to be all about that, but for now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, Harrison Reese, Robbie Martin McAvoy, NihongoKaizen.org, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Special thanks also to new donors to the History of Japan Patreon, Brody, George, and Yana, for supporting the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week as we turn our attention from politics and take a look at the culture of classical Japan.